kind of response video to one of these Hop to the Day guy videos. Yeah, I just saw Puro was pissed off at him, so I went to go see what it was about, and I don't know, this video was stupid, but I don't really see, they must have had an argument somewhere else. But anyway, it doesn't matter. So this subject of value always keeps coming up, so it's about time I do some videos on it, and I think I'll just title it, by volume number. And so maybe just watch, maybe don't watch this one, wait till the end, and maybe the end will be a nice summation of everything. But really it's not as complicated as people make it out to be, in my opinion. There is a truth to value, and then the rest of it, ethics and justice, these are just things that fall logically. So there's this argument between people who are utilitarian versus these people who are Kantian in terms of they have some sort of virtue ethics. So it's kind of like whatever it is, the other guy's name, little or big lungy, Ludi, whatever he is. Yeah, so these virtue ethics people, that somehow all you have to have is good intentions, and the ethical ground is covered. And it might be true in terms of, you're going to use how strict definitions of words like ethics, but the bottom line is there's a net productivity to your existence. You will impact things in positive and negative ways, and it can be added up. And so I guess what I'd argue is that we're not going to be able to, it's going to take a lot of discussion to get to some sort of like, these are the core root things that have value and all the rest of this crap is just crap. So that's a more complex argument. But just for the sake of argument, let's just say there's two states that we can be in, good or bad. And so we can either get green or red. So you either give other people or yourself a green state of being or a red state of being, and a certain amount of that. And depending on how many people you facilitate the existence of or prevent the existence of, or how they get harmed in the long run. And this really gets convoluted and complex. As I pointed out in a previous video, even something like smallpox, if I had the power to go back in the past and squish the first smallpox, the first little poxy, so it never existed as a disease that afflicted human beings, would that be a good thing to do in the long-term interest of human beings? Certainly in the interest of the individuals who died from it, even that's complicated. Because you can't say for sure they weren't better off dying of smallpox than waiting a couple of years to die of something else, and after having a couple of kids. And so it would have impacted things like world population, environmental problems. We could be 20 years further into global warming if it wasn't for smallpox. Some kind of equation like that could be realistically the truth, and it could in fact be that smallpox was a good thing just because human behavior is so out of control that if it wasn't for these negative control mechanisms, we'd be even further out of control. And that's the hideous nature of it. But the truth is, there's this utilitarian truth here. There's a truth to the impact. Consequences matter, and intent doesn't really matter. So if I prevent rape by having a high penalty for it and a guarantee, like I figure out some mechanism that makes it guaranteed that we always catch the rapist, and so I deter rapists, not because they don't want to rape women, not because they do the right thing and say it's not right to harm women. No, they only do it because they're afraid of getting caught. By these virtue efficacy people, I haven't accomplished anything. But, in utilitarian fact, I have accomplished something. I prevented this unnecessary harm. And it's just that obvious that intent doesn't fix wrong behavior. It just doesn't. And bad intent that creates a positive result is still a positive result, and it's undeniable. So it really just doesn't matter what the intent is. It matters on what the product is, the net. Show me the money, and the money is in the the welfare preserved. So some of this logic is really obvious. It's like if you can perpetrate a small harm to create a big harm, just to prevent a big harm, well, it seems kind of obvious that you incur the small harm to prevent the big harm. Where it gets complicated is in this social contract kind of deal, where we sort of make a deal with each other that we're not going to decide for each other what we should or shouldn't do, that we're not going to oblige each other to be virtuous or do the right thing, or incur a price that the individual might not feel is justified, or for somebody else's welfare, or all this other argument that could be made. That we're not going to sacrifice involuntarily, and it's not a meaningless thing. This social contract. So there's two elements here. There's the absolute truth of the circumstance. So what's the end result? And then there's these complications of the nuance of surviving each other's proximity, living with each other. Living with each other requires us to do one thing, and that thing isn't necessarily correlation. It doesn't necessarily correlate perfectly with productive outcomes. So again, I could argue that slavery was hugely productive in terms of, yes, some misery was caused, but a huge amount of misery in the future was prevented because of the higher standard of living and probably all the stuff that we got so much earlier because of it, computers and the polio vaccine and maybe a whole bunch of other stuff that was facilitated through that evil. So the intent of the slave owners was definitely evil. I mean, they were non-virtuous, and they were certainly ignorant, which is got to be considered a negative. If you're going to claim they didn't have knowledge of their crime, but the same argument we made for meat eaters now. You could say, well, they're ignorant of the horror they're committing, of the crime they're committing. Yeah, I don't think they're that ignorant. But anyway, so I want to get to his video, but it's just so hard. He's so hard to listen to. I mean, he has every negative way of presenting an argument. It's just so drags it out, and it's just so tedious. But anyway, that's a ad hominem attack, maybe. I mean, it's just a practical truth. It does make it harder to listen to. All right. So what's any other pre-arguments to the argument? So anyway, well, okay, I'll play some of his video and then we'll deal with some of these issues.
Or not. And I think it's fairly clear from what I've said that this is singularly because of their inability to reason.
I don't see huge pauses. I don't even know. Inability to reason. Well, anyway, he kept saying the word reason, so he's always focused on this word reason. And there really isn't any good definition of this word reason beyond performing logic. I mean, your only reasoning is logical. To be reasonable, you got to be logical. Reasoning is performing logic, and logic is basically just going, if this plus that, or even this plus this equals that. So if it's this and it's also this, then it's equal probably that. And you do that by comparing it to other things. So and other examples of rocks always fall down, and sticks always fall down, and this always falls down, and so you draw a conclusion about some other thing that's very similar to rocks and sticks. So yes, it would make sense that it's going to fall down. And as long as there's not a rational alternative theory, a theory backed by some sort of contrary evidence, some example where rocks or sticks or something like those things doesn't fall down, then it's a valid surmise based on the evidence. And the stronger the evidence, the more solid the logic, and the more authoritative the opinion can be expressed. The theory can be defended more aggressively, depending on the strength of the bulk of the evidence and the absence of any capacity to even contrive a reasonable alternative theory. But that's logic. It's not that complicated. So all it has to do is be consistent with the evidence and not challengeable by an alternative theory equally based in evidence. So, yeah, reasoning isn't the focus here. And his implication was that somehow this all evolved, and it didn't evolve. We didn't evolve reasoning, logic itself. We evolved the capacity to scheme, and that's what animals do, and that's what we do. We scheme. We scheme by creating models and comparing outcomes and running it through our head, like what happens if I do this? Well, what happened in the past when I did that? So having a memory and being able to compare memories to current circumstances, that's what reasoning is, that's what logic is. And yeah, we only do it better because of the information we've gleaned over the last 10,000 years. You know, without something in, you're not going to have anything out. And 50,000 years ago, anyway, we didn't have much in, and not much was coming out of our logic machine, our scheming machine.
In possessing the facet of reason, we are genetically gifted a tool which is advantageous to our existence.
Well, duh. Yeah, and again, but it's the same tool that most mammals have. Most mammals have a scheming tool. Okay, they have different levels of development. But let's be clear that we're not. Our humanness is mostly made out of information. Without the knowledge, without your education, you're nothing. You're an animal. With just doing the crude scheming, and that's what most of the other animals are left with, because they don't have 10,000 years of language and culture.
Evolution has honed this capability with this purpose in mind.
Yeah, well, that just doesn't go anywhere. Evolution has honed this capability with this purpose in mind. No. It's a scheming tool, and to scheme, to manipulate that environment, that's what my brain wants me to do, is manipulate what's out there to my advantage. And there's absolutely no advantage for it to give me a faculty that isn't accurate, that isn't accurately modeling that world. So the more accurate my models, obviously the more constructive my schemes will be. That just should without saying. And evolution didn't give me that. Evolution just gave me this logic device, this scheming device, period. And it gave me some desires. So it gave me desires and then said, use this intellect to scheme the satisfaction of your desires, to achieve your comfort. Alright? And that's the crude mechanism. That's the dumb animal that exists in us. And all we're doing as philosophers is saying, well, you're defining the role of a pawn, but we know what the whole game is. And we know that that you are just one of many pawns, and that you are realistically in the world. You can't consume something equal in value to yourself. You can't consume something else's comfort to gain your satisfaction and call yourself efficient, because you've now essentially burned down something. It's like you build a house and then you burn down somebody else's. There's no productivity to that. There's no efficiency in that. That isn't functional by a logical standard. And the logic being the basic concession to value. That you're claiming value to your own desire, then you have to concede value of other people's. I mean, if your welfare has value, it's only logical to concede the truth that the other mechanisms that are in every other feature equal to yourself and can't be alternatively explained to be less than you. There's no alternative theory that I could use to say other people aren't just as important as me, that their comfort isn't just as important as mine, or just as big, or just as powerful. There's no rational theory, no logical theory, no evidence-based theory I could contrive to excuse using somebody else, consuming their welfare to gain enhancement of my own welfare. That's just logical.
It then naturally follows that this is why we reason. We reason for our betterment as individuals, as a community, and as a species.
Yeah, well, whatever. That again, that's it's just not an accurate enough way to describe what evolution has, how we've acquired these tools. And the bottom line is yes, okay, we gained advantage by having a scheming brain. Okay, but let's concede also that the other mechanism that made it possible for us to survive was having an unsuppressible ego, a never say die kind of attitude, of an aggressive nature. The fact that we have impulses that lead us to maybe kill the other guy, because that'll be to our advantage. And so these mechanisms of motivation are not purely reasonable or rational, and we are essentially using the brain to defend those crude premises often. And so again, the intelligence has to do the cleaning up of the natural residue. So let's not say that nature gave us a perfect thinking machine. It gave us a scheming machine, and it put it in the hands of rather crude desires. And the only way to fix that is to have that scheming machine not only correct itself and say, I'm not just going to be a scheming machine, I'm a logic device, first declare itself that, and then say, and I have to apply that cleansing logic to the structure of this selfish mechanism that's out for his own interest, or the interest of his own kind, and will essentially, burn down something of equal value to itself to gain its comfort, illogically.
Of course, we can reason for pleasure alone. Some of us like to do that just because we like it is good and to exercise our faculties.
No, whatever that is. That's just bibble babble. If it's entertaining you, then it's usually entertaining some part of your ego because it's a puzzle or a challenge, or it's doing something else and it's feeding some kind of cardinal, some sort of basic desire mechanism. So don't pretend that you do any of that or find any of that intriguing if your brain didn't have an ego mechanism and it wasn't hungry for a competition.
But, I know that when I reason by myself, I can personally gain at nobody's expense.
Well, it depends on what you're reasoning while you're by yourself. If you're plotting, which most reasoning would involve, then it's going to implicate others. If you're contriving strategies, thinking of ways to manipulate, well, how can I get, my best friend out of the house so I can fuck his wife? I mean, if that's what you're doing, those are going to have implications. I mean, I can't think of much you could be thinking about or contemplating that in some way doesn't convert into action in some way, or into a disposition towards action. So in some way it's going to affect your future behavior. Almost every thought we have changes our identity and changes the complexion of our nature, the basic composition of our personality, and how we will react in the future will be dictated by those processes.
And when I reason within a community of others, It's clear that I have no logical basis in which to privilege my specific wants over the needs of anybody else.
Well, to make this argument over anybody else is, again, that's an absolute statement that just seems excessive. You probably can come up with some sort of reasonable theory that creates some sort of hierarchy or some sort of merit. Like, some people are more likely to cure cancer than other people. Some people are more likely to do something productive for their fellow mankind than others. I mean, these are truths that exist. So you can't absolutely say that statement. But certainly in general principle, the guiding direction you're trying to head in is founded on this idea that essentially we are equals. And essentially you cannot deny somebody else the liberty that you enjoy.
Needs or wants of anybody else. And to do so is actually to prejudice the game of reason and the
Yeah, so when you say that, you're basically being a utilitarian. Now you've just conceded to the utilitarian perspective, because you're basically saying that the end, the biggest picture, the grandest result is what's important. It's not important what happens to me individually, it's my impact on all these others. It has to be included in the diagram of my behavior. And then you're also saying, well, my race isn't the only race, and my nation isn't the only nation. So you're conceding all the utilitarian logic that says there's the biggest frame viewpoint is where the net addition takes place. It's where the last number pops out, and it's either positive or negative for your impact in this whole pinball cycle of events. The world is either a better place with you or a lesser place with you. Period.
Read collective purpose to begin a reasoning game. In such a situation, where we have a load of individuals all vying for vested interests, it's obvious that the agreement to reason together has been abrogated.
The agreement to reason together, there was never any agreement to do that anyway. So even that doesn't go anywhere. So yeah, it breaks down at the individual level first. That's the obvious place it's going to break down. Because yeah, we're all selfish, and we're all going to look for for angles to improve our status, or to try to make somebody else have the broken leg, not us. If something has to happen, we're going to, not in my backyard. That's our nature. And we have to overcome it through these principles and these ideals, but I'm just saying that is the nature of the beast, and we should advocate and argue for doing as little as that as possible, trying to suppress that nature as best we can. But the collective is a long way from being any kind of collective, because even if we agree that we all should not be partisan to our personal interest, we are partisan to ideologies and perspectives and values that are very divergent. And so even if we agree not to be selfish, we're still not going to agree on what is purposeful or useful or functional or valuable. And that friction is, again, going to destroy collective action. Collective action is going to be staggered and stuttered and stilted and corrupted by the fact that we have no consensus to move in any one direction.
This I think is the Kantian rationale behind all his philosophy.
Yeah, well, I'm sorry. Again, I don't agree at all. Like I said, you just basically articulated the argument for utilitarianism. His argument was for an honor code, and they're hugely different.
On ethics.
I don't know what
the question then becomes how in the first instance or at first pass, do we guard against the subversion of the reasoning of the collective?
The subversion of the reasoning of the collective. Again, I don't even know what that means. The collective doesn't get to take advantage of the pieces. The pieces don't make a bigger collective. The only thing they do is that through majorities or something you can have more influence on the collective. But the collective isn't like a super magnification of the intelligence of the parts. The whole isn't greater than the sum of the parts. The parts are greater than, some of the parts are outstanding. Some of the parts are garbage. So ideally it'd be better if the collective was driven by the best of the parts rather than this mudded, polluted, dumbed down thing that ends up being the collective compromise. And that's what it's always going to be, is some stupid, cruddy, crappy compromise.
If we can answer this question, then it would seem that we might be well on the way to finding our and meeting our goal of finding an objective starting point with which to base our ethics.
Yeah, well, I don't see how the two are connected at all. Finding an objective starting point on which to base our ethics, that almost is self-generating, the starting point. I mean, you come into the world and value becomes apparent to you. I mean, the first thing you notice is that you have this thing called a good feeling and a bad feeling, and everything else that has value somehow derives its value based on whether it makes you smile or gives you diarrhea. So we can make it that simple. There's two kinds of things in the world. It either makes you, let's say we just converted everything into those two extremes. Now we know it's grayer than that. We know there's more sensations than this, but I'm just saying for the sake of argument, we can do this cheat, and it's not cheating the truth too much. Yeah, so there's only two reactions you could have to everything in the world. It makes you smile or it gives you diarrhea. And what we learn through that process of just sampling the world is we say, does this make me smile or does this give me diarrhea? And that's what it comes down to. And so then we start to add up, there are things that make me smile, this, but it gave somebody else diarrhea to make it. So now we got a conflict, okay, because now this is costing somebody else something, even though it's giving me something. And now we have to do this more complicated exchange rate thing, like how many euros is their diarrhea worth versus my smiley face. And that's where the currency, it gets very sloppy to try to figure out, how many smiles are worth how much diarrhea.
Kant notes that whenever our actions are based upon contingencies in moral context, we are almost certainly serving ourselves as individuals.
Well, again, like I said, that argument is just basically defeated by the simple argument that all the things that deter us from doing harm to others are very good deterrents. So yes, I could know not to drink and drive just because it's wrong, because I don't want to put other people at jeopardy. So I could have the virtuous, ethical understanding that it's wrong and not do it. Now, there could be a law, and that law could tell somebody else that, well, even though I like drinking and driving, and even though I don't give a fuck about my neighbor, I won't drink and drive because, I don't want to lose my license and have to pay a huge fine and have my life ruined. So the deterrence is there. They have no ethics, but the bottom line is the behavior is improved, and the welfare of the general, the largest dynamic, is enhanced. There's less diarrhea and more smiley faces. So it's a net benefit. So Kant is full of shit. Yeah, sorry, no sale. Virtue is irrelevant. Behavior is all that matters, and its consequences, and understanding them. Period. And it's the end result. I mean, we can't anticipate, we can't know in every circumstance what the right thing to do is. Sometimes the truth is going to be elusive, and we're going to be stuck with some probability that isn't certain. We can't be sure if it's 50-50 or 60-40. We're just not going to know what the right thing to do is, what is going to have the right outcome. And so in those circumstances, virtue won't even help you, because you can't even virtuously know what the right thing to do is.
Or as an isolated group within a larger group, serving a self-interest. We see this by observing, say, what's called a conditional form in mathematics or logic, and that is the if-then form, where we have if the antecedent, then the consequent. The consequent in this case being implied as some beneficial state of being relating to some personal particulars. And thus Kant tells us moral actions are categorical by nature, not hypothetical, as in the if-then